There are names that do not allow the person who carries them to live quietly. Some people are born into comfort. Others are born into struggle. But there are a few who are born carrying history itself. Even before they understand what history is, they do not ask for this burden. It is placed on their shoulders the moment they open their eyes to the world. In West Africa, names remember what books forget. The land remembers what maps try to erase. And the ancestors are never as silent as the world pretends they are. Imagine growing up on soil that once ruled itself, fed itself, named itself. Imagine knowing that long before outsiders arrived with rulers and flags, your people had kings, laws, trade, and dignity. Now imagine being told, day after day, that none of that ever mattered, that it never existed, that you came from nowhere. This is the quiet violence that does not leave scars on the skin, but presses heavily on the spirit. For some, survival means learning how to bend, learning how to stay invisible, learning how to keep your head down and your questions unasked. But there are others who discover, very early in life, that bending comes at a price their soul is not willing to pay. There is a moment, often unspoken, when a person understands this truth. If I bow today, my children will be asked to bow lower tomorrow. This story begins in that moment, before power, before titles, before prisons and presidencies, before praise and condemnation. It begins with a young African man, surrounded by the weight of memory and the pressure of forgetting. A man born into a world that expected him to accept smallness as reality, silence as wisdom, and obedience as peace. But peace built on erasure is never real peace. The ancestors had stood tall on this same land. They had governed, traded, and dreamed without permission. Their names were not myths to be admired from a distance. They were obligations. They were reminders. They were questions that demanded answers. What do you do when your very existence contradicts the story you are being taught to believe? What do you choose when safety requires silence, but dignity demands voice? This is not yet the story of a president. It is not yet the story of a nation. It is the story of a choice that comes before all of that. A choice between comfort and conscience, between being allowed to live quietly and deciding to live standing up. And once that choice is made, there is no return. Modibo Keïta did not grow up believing he was special, but he grew up knowing he was not free. In Bamako, where he was born, history was not something written neatly on paper. It lived in stories whispered by elders, in prayers spoken quietly, in names passed down with care. His family believed they carried the blood of the Keïta line, the same lineage that once gave rise to the Mali Empire. Whether this could be proven did not matter as much as what it meant. In West African culture, ancestry is not decoration. It is responsibility. To carry the name Keïta was to be reminded that this land had once governed itself with confidence and order. Long before foreign languages filled the classrooms and foreign flags marked the soil, African hands had shaped law, trade, and learning. That memory did not disappear when outsiders arrived. It was pushed underground, forced to survive quietly. As a young man, Modibo Keïta learned to live between two worlds. One world told him who he was allowed to be. The other whispered who he truly came from. That tension shaped him long before politics ever did. He saw how colonial rule did more than control territory. It worked patiently to shrink the spirit. Africans were encouraged to forget their greatness, to doubt their capacity, to accept that leadership belonged elsewhere. This forgetting was not accidental. It was systematic. For Keïta, the idea of ancestry became more than pride. It became a measuring stick. Each choice he made had to answer a silent question. Would this honor those who stood before me, or would it make their sacrifices meaningless? He did not chase wealth. He did not seek comfort. Those paths were open to men willing to cooperate quietly, but cooperation often required something he could not give: submission of the soul. There is a particular loneliness that comes with carrying history. It separates a person from easy friendships and simple ambitions. Others may choose survival. You are expected to choose meaning. Keïta understood that if he accepted a life designed to make him small, he would not only betray himself, he would betray generations who had been powerful before power was stolen from them. This understanding did not make him angry. It made him steady. When people later described him as rigid or uncompromising, they did not see this earlier formation. They did not see a young man shaped by memory rather than ambition. A man who believed that dignity was not something to be negotiated. His sense of duty did not come from ideology. It came from inheritance, from the belief that history watches us, even when the world does not, from the understanding that one person's choices can either protect memory or help erase it. Before Modibo Keïta ever spoke of nations, unity, or independence, he had already made a quieter decision. He would not live as if his people had no past. And once that decision was made, the path ahead narrowed. Man who refuses to forget is already dangerous to those who benefit from forgetting. Teaching did more than give Modibo Keïta a profession. It gave him a front row seat to a quiet tragedy. In the classrooms of Bamako, Sikasso, and Timbuktu, he watched young African minds being shaped with great care, but toward a very specific destination. They were taught how to read and write, how to calculate and repeat, but they were not taught how to recognize themselves. Their past was reduced to footnotes. Their ancestors were mentioned briefly. If at all, great African civilizations were treated as accidents rather than achievements. Keïta understood something many did not. This kind of education was not neutral. It was precise. Colonial schooling did not need to beat the child. It only needed to confuse him. If a student learned to see Europe as the source of all order and Africa as a place waiting to be rescued, the work was done. The chains would no longer be necessary. Standing before his students each day, Keïta felt the weight of contradiction. He was paid to teach lessons that slowly erased the very people sitting in front of him. He saw curiosity dim. He saw pride soften into doubt. And he realized that silence, in this setting, was not harmless. For a long time, he wrestled with an uncomfortable truth. Teaching facts without context was not education. It was training. And training a child to forget who they are is a form of violence that leaves no visible wounds. There comes a moment in every life when knowledge turns into responsibility. For Keïta, that moment arrived quietly, without ceremony. He understood that remaining only a teacher would make him complicit in something he could no longer accept. He began organizing cultural activities, theater, and discussions. These were not political rallies. They were spaces where Africans could see themselves reflected with dignity, where stories older than colonial borders could breathe again, where memory was allowed to stand upright. But memory, once awakened, rarely stays contained. Keïta soon found himself drawn into circles of teachers and thinkers who asked dangerous questions. Why were Africans governed without consent? Why were their resources extracted without benefit? Why was obedience treated as maturity and resistance as childishness? The more he asked, the clearer it became that education alone was not enough. Knowledge without action only sharpens the pain of awareness. At some point, the question stopped being whether he should speak and became whether he could live with himself if he did not. He knew the risks. He had seen how quickly outspoken Africans were labeled troublemakers, agitators, or worse. Still, something within him refused to retreat. The classroom had taught him this much. If a generation grows up believing it has no past, it will accept any future offered to it. Keïta could not accept that future, and so the teacher stepped beyond the safety of the lesson plan. He stepped into a life where words carried consequences, where silence was no longer an option, and where speaking, once begun, would lead him directly into danger. Speaking openly carried a price, and Modibo Keïta learned that price quickly. Once he crossed from private concern into public critique, he was no longer just a teacher with opinions. He became a problem, not because he shouted, but because he wrote, not because he carried weapons, but because his words carried memory. In colonial systems, memory is dangerous. Keïta helped create a small publication that questioned authority and exposed the quiet injustices Africans were expected to accept as normal. It did not call for violence. It did not demand chaos. It simply refused to pretend that domination was benevolent. That refusal was enough. When he was arrested and held in Paris, far from home, the message was clear. This was not about correcting behavior. It was about reminding him where power truly lived. To be detained at the heart of the empire was meant to shrink him, to make him feel small and isolated. Instead, it clarified everything. In those weeks of confinement, Keïta understood that there would be no safe middle ground. The system did not require him to be wrong. It only required him to be quiet. And silence, once demanded, rarely remains optional. He realized something else as well. The empire did not fear African anger as much as it feared African clarity. Rage could be dismissed. Clarity could not. A man who understands his position and still refuses to bow becomes unpredictable. After his release, life did not return to normal. It could not. Surveillance replaced anonymity. Suspicion followed him into rooms that once felt familiar. Doors closed more quickly. Conversations grew cautious, but retreat was no longer possible. Keïta had tasted the truth that changes a person forever when you have already paid the price for speaking. Silence no longer offers protection. The cost has been revealed, and fear loses its power. Rather than soften his position, he deepened it. He joined political movements that demanded representation and dignity for African people. He stood for election, not because he believed the system was fair, but because refusing to engage would surrender the future entirely to those who benefited from injustice. Every step forward made him more visible. Every success made him more dangerous in the eyes of colonial administrators. Yet he continued, not driven by optimism, but by obligation. Keïta was no longer asking whether freedom would come easily. He was asking whether it was worth the risk. And for him, the answer had already been given. A man who has been punished for telling the truth understands this. The punishment does not end when you stop speaking. It ends only when you stop caring. Keïta chose to keep caring. From that point on, his life followed a narrowing road, one that led away from personal safety and toward collective consequence. A road where every word mattered, every decision carried weight, and turning back meant betraying not only himself, but all those who had begun to listen. The teacher had become a voice, and voices, once heard, are very difficult to silence. By the time Modibo Keïta began speaking openly about African unity, he was no longer thinking in terms of borders. To him, the lines drawn across maps did not represent nations. They represented interruptions, cuts made by outsiders who never intended Africans to see themselves as one people again. Independence, if it only replaced foreign rulers with local flags, would be incomplete. Keïta believed that freedom without unity was fragile. As new African nations emerged, many leaders focused inward. They guarded their territories carefully, fearful of losing what little authority they had just gained. Keïta understood that fear, but he also understood its danger. A continent divided into small, suspicious shows of power would remain easy to influence, easy to weaken, easy to control. This belief placed him in rare company. Alongside figures like Kwame Nkrumah and Sekou Touré, Keïta imagined an Africa that spoke with a shared voice, not a continent ruled by one man or one state, but one guided by mutual responsibility. Yet even as he spoke of unity, Keïta issued a warning that surprised many. He rejected the idea that Africa should simply replace one empire with another. He spoke clearly against what he called a new form of domination, one that could arise from within. Power, he insisted, was dangerous no matter who held it. This position cost him allies. It would have been easier to claim historic entitlement, easier to argue that certain nations deserved more influence based on past glory, easier to allow ambition to dress itself up as destiny. Keïta refused. He believed that unity built on coercion would rot from the inside. In choosing restraint, he chose isolation. Some saw him as impractical. Others called him idealistic. A few labeled him naive. But Keïta understood something deeper. The measure of leadership was not how much land one could claim, but how much harm one refused to cause. His vision demanded patience in a moment that rewarded aggression. It demanded trust in a time shaped by suspicion. And most difficult of all, it demanded sacrifice without guarantee of success. Keïta was willing to make that sacrifice. He participated in the creation of continental institutions, not for prestige, but for principle. He believed Africa needed a space where disputes could be settled without blood, where dignity could be defended collectively. This belief placed him at the moral center of early unity efforts, even as it left him politically exposed. Unity, as he imagined it, was not loud. It was disciplined. It required leaders to check their egos and nations to restrain their fears. That kind of unity does not attract applause. It attracts resistance. Keïta accepted that resistance as the price of integrity. In a world that rewarded dominance, he argued for balance. In a moment defined by urgency, he spoke of long memory, and while others raced to secure power, he asked a quieter question: what kind of Africa will remain after the excitement fades? His answer was clear: an Africa that survives must first learn how not to destroy itself. That belief would shape everything that followed. It would guide his decisions, isolate his leadership, and ultimately place him on a collision course with forces that did not value restraint. But for Keïta, there was no alternative. Unity without conscience was not unity at all. When Modibo Keïta became the first president of Mali, celebration was brief, and reality arrived quickly. Independence did not come with instructions. The country he inherited was young, fragile, and surrounded by competing pressures. Foreign governments watched closely. Internal divisions waited quietly. Expectations were high. but resources were thin. Every decision carried consequences far beyond intention. Keïta believed that political freedom, without economic control, was an illusion. If Mali remained dependent on outside interests, independence would exist only in name. This conviction led him toward a socialist path, one that promised shared responsibility and national ownership. It was a difficult choice, and he knew it. Socialism, for Keïta, was not theory. It was protection. A way to keep land, labor, and dignity from slipping back into foreign hands. But ideals, once placed into governance, encounter human complexity. Not everyone shared his patience. Not everyone trusted his restraint. As pressure mounted, Keïta tightened control. Opposition voices were limited. A single party structure was enforced. He told himself this was temporary, necessary. A nation, he believed, needed unity before it could afford disagreement. Here, the story grows uncomfortable. Power isolates even those who never sought it for themselves. The man who once feared erasing voices now struggled to manage them. The line between protection and control blurred. Decisions meant to guard stability began to cost trust. Keïta was not blind to this, but he was trapped by circumstance and conviction. To loosen his grip felt like inviting chaos. To hold tighter risked betraying the very values that had brought him to leadership. This is the burden few speak of. Leadership does not only test morality, it exhausts it. Critics grew louder. Allies grew cautious. The economy strained under the weight of ambition and resistance. And within the military, resentment quietly took root. Soldiers watched a government that spoke of dignity while struggling to provide certainty. Keïta remained committed to his vision, even as the ground shifted beneath him. He believed history would eventually understand. That sacrifice now would protect generations later. But history does not always offer patience to those who ask for it. The loneliness of leadership deepened. Decisions were made behind closed doors. Trust narrowed. The man who once believed deeply in collective responsibility now carried the fate of the nation, largely alone. This was not the triumph many expected independence to deliver. It was endurance. It was tension. It was the heavy knowledge that every option carried loss. Keïta did not govern perfectly. He governed sincerely. And sincerity, when paired with power, does not guarantee safety. The stage was set for a reckoning, not because his vision lacked purpose, but because nations, like people, strain under unresolved fear. The president stood firm, but storms do not announce themselves. They gather quietly, waiting for the moment when balance finally gives way. The removal of Modibo Keïta did not come with drama. It came with quiet precision. In the early hours of a military takeover, his presidency ended without a public trial, without a national debate, and without the courtesy of explanation. One moment, he was the leader of a sovereign nation. The next, he was a prisoner whose name was spoken carefully. If at all, power left him quickly. Silence replaced ceremony. For those who overthrew him, the goal was simple: remove the man, erase the influence, reset the story. History, they believed, could be redirected by force. What they underestimated was the endurance of dignity. In prison, Keïta lost everything that once defined him publicly. No office, no audience, no ability to shape events. But something remained untouched. His refusal to beg. His refusal to confess to crimes he did not believe in. His refusal to rewrite his own life, to make others comfortable. Prison tests a person in ways power never does. It strips away applause and leaves only character. Years passed slowly. The world outside moved on. New leaders spoke new promises. And Keïta remained. Confined, isolated, largely forgotten by international voices that once welcomed him. Yet within Mali, memory did not disappear. People spoke his name quietly, with caution and respect, not because his rule had been flawless, but because his fall felt unfinished. Because there was a sense that something larger than politics had been interrupted. Keïta did not attempt to escape. He did not issue grand statements from behind bars. His resistance took a different form. It lived in endurance, in the simple act of remaining himself when everything encouraged surrender. To survive prison without surrendering one's inner posture is a rare strength. It requires the belief that dignity does not depend on recognition, that a man can be defeated publicly and remain intact privately. When Keïta died in captivity, there were no parades, no international condolences worthy of his stature. But his death did something powerful. It closed the distance between his words and his life. He has spoken of sacrifice, unity, and restraint, and in the end, he paid the price without compromise. For many Africans, this was not the story of a fallen leader. It was the story of a man who refused to be reshaped by fear. His imprisonment revealed a truth often avoided. The measure of a life is not how long one holds power, but how one behaves when power is gone. Modibo Keïta left prison without walking free, but he left behind something more difficult to imprison. A reminder that leadership, stripped of titles, still leaves traces, and that some men, even in chains, remain upright. The silence surrounding his final years did not erase him. It clarified him. History did not end with his confinement. It waited. In the end, Modibo Keïta did not leave behind monuments of stone or wealth measured in numbers. What he left behind was far less visible and far more difficult to destroy. He left a posture. Across his life, he made a series of choices that never promised comfort. He chose memory over convenience. He chose unity over expansion. He chose restraint over domination. And when power was taken from him, he chose dignity over survival at any cost. He could have spoken less. He could have compromised more. He could have rewritten his beliefs to fit the expectations of those who watched him closely. Many did. He did not. That is why his story does not end with his presidency. It does not end with his imprisonment. It lives on in the quiet question his life leaves behind. What does it mean to stand upright when standing carries a price? Keïta's life reminds us that history is not only shaped by victories. It is shaped by refusals, by moments when a person decides that some things cannot be traded, even when the cost is high. For those listening today, especially those who have lived long enough to see promises rise and fall, his story may feel familiar. Many have known what it means to be told to wait, to adjust, to be patient, while dignity is postponed. Many have felt the pressure to soften truths in exchange for peace. Keïta's answer was simple, though never easy. Peace without dignity is not peace. Unity without conscience is not unity. And survival that requires forgetting who you are is a slow kind of disappearance. He was not perfect. He did not solve every problem. But he refused to abandon the question of who Africans were meant to be after independence faded into routine. That refusal places him among the quiet pillars of African history, remembered not for spectacle, but for steadiness. Some may search for his name among lists of historical facts. counting years in office or policies enacted. Others may encounter his story late at night, listening for calm reflection, like history for sleep. But those who listen closely will hear something deeper. They will hear a man speaking across generations, reminding us that Black history is not only about struggle endured, but about standards maintained, about the courage to say no when saying yes would be easier. Modibo Keïta belongs among the history legends, not because he ruled without fault, but because he lived without surrender. And as long as stories like his are told, the memory he protected will remain awake, not loud, not demanding, just standing.